Over the past few videos, I've scaled each of the 4 Chaos Gods individually. I've explored Khorne's anger issues, Tzeentch's schizophrenia, Nurgle's concerning lack of hygiene, and Slaanesh's crippling drug problem. But now comes the question that's probably started thousands of arguments throughout the Warhammer community. Who is truly the strongest Chaos God in Warhammer 40K? And in today's video, we're going to answer that question. I'm first going to break down exactly how the warp works, then I'll briefly revisit each of the 4 Chaos Gods and discuss their abilities and strengths. After that, I'll examine the different periods throughout galactic history when each Chaos God arguably ruled supreme over their brothers. And finally, we'll answer the question that started this entire wacky series. Who is the strongest Chaos God in Warhammer 40K today? So make sure you grab yourself a drink, preferably milk, place your bets on your favorite dark god, and prepare yourself, as always, to dolphin dive straight into the goal. It's time to power scale. First, before we get into autistically ranking the Chaos Gods, we need to discuss the warp. For those who don't know, the warp is the dimension that runs parallel to real space or the material universe. It exists beyond the boundaries of physical reality, unrestricted by time, causality, or the conventional laws of existence. It is a realm of seemingly infinite scope, without form or structure, composed entirely of the reflections of mortal thoughts and emotions, such as fear, hope, rage, ambition, and despair, as described in the 8th edition Chaos Demons Codex. The warp or immaterium is an abstraction made manifest by the roiling emotions of mortals. Unbound by the laws of time and space, it is a random, unstructured panorama of pure energy and unfocused consciousness, eternally shifting through endless in its potential. This is where the Chaos Gods reside. Beings born from and sustained by the thoughts and emotions of all mortal life. And you guys probably know the rest. Khorne is empowered by rage and bloodshed.
Blood for the blood god! Blood for the blood god! Blood for the blood god!
Tzeentch feeds upon ambition and change.
We are going to steal the moon!
Nurgle draws strength from despair and acceptance.
Uh-oh. Stinky.
And Slaanesh thrives on excess and obsession.
What is drugs?
But this is also what makes ranking the Chaos Gods so gosh darn difficult. The warp is not beholden to a linear timeline. Events can be occurring, have already occurred, and have yet to occur all at once. Cause and effect break down entirely. This creates a massive problem when trying to determine which Chaos God is the strongest. Because from the warp's perspective, history does not unfold in a straight line. The best example of this is Slaanesh. From the perspective of the material universe, Slaanesh was born in M30 and caused the collapse of the Eldari Empire, as the Dark Prince devoured billions of Eldar souls, consumed much of their pantheon, and entered the Great Game as the youngest of the Chaos Gods. But the warp sees things very differently, as stated in the 8th edition Chaos Demons Codex. In the warp, things are different, for the immaterium is not bound by linear time. Events do not occur in a strict sequence of cause then effect. As his rival gods reckon, Slaanesh has always existed and has yet never existed at all. So yeah, it's kind of a confusing mess. If we're being completely technical here, there isn't really a definitive way to rank the Chaos Gods across all of existence, because the realm they inhabit fundamentally rejects the concept of chronology. But, and you knew there was going to be a but, otherwise this video would be about 30 seconds long. If we examine events from the perspective of the material universe, there are absolutely periods throughout history where certain Chaos Gods held significantly more influence and power than their brothers. And that's the approach we're going to be using in today's ranking. Now that we've discussed how the warp functions, let's briefly go over each of the 4 Chaos Gods and what they bring to the table. First, we have Khorne, the Blood God, my personal favorite. Khorne is the embodiment of the emotions, beliefs, and thoughts of rage, violence, war, and martial prowess. Every act of bloodshed, whether committed by a noble warrior or a frothing berserker, ultimately empowers him. Among the Chaos Gods, Khorne is often portrayed as the mightiest in direct combat, possessing immense physical power and commanding endless legions of demons from his brass citadel. His influence grows whenever the galaxy descends into war, which, as you can imagine, is pretty often in Warhammer 40K. Next is Tzeentch, the Changer of Ways, the god of ambition, knowledge, hope, deceit, sorcery, and of course, change. He is arguably the most intelligent of the Chaos Gods, weaving schemes that can span millennia and manipulating entire civilizations without them ever realizing it. Tzeentch is also the undisputed master of sorcery, possessing psychic abilities that are able to reshape the very fundamental aspects of reality. Every spell, ritual, and mutation ultimately falls within his domain. Then we have Nurgle, the Plague Lord, the big old green chud, the god of disease, decay, despair, and rot. While that sounds all very depressing, Nurgle is ironically depicted as the most joyful of the Chaos Gods, viewing his countless plagues as gifts rather than curses. Nurgle's power swells during times of suffering, stagnation, and widespread plague. Finally, we have Slaanesh, the Dark Prince, the youngest member of the Chaos Pantheon, and the embodiment of excess in all forms. While many people immediately associate Slaanesh with pleasure, the Dark Prince's domain is far broader than just that. Perfection, obsession, addiction, pride, greed, sensation, and unrestrained desire all fall under Slaanesh's influence. He, or I guess she, or I guess it, is perhaps the most seductive of the ruinous pantheon, able to corrupt even the most disciplined individuals by exploiting their deepest wants and ambitions. Each of the Chaos Gods is a reflection of the passions and emotions that form them. Each draws powers from emotions, actions, and beliefs that are effectively impossible to eradicate from all sentient life. And each of them is forever locked in a war with each other in what is called the Great Game. This game is perfectly depicted in the 8th edition Chaos Demons Codex, which states, "The warp is not merely the home of the Dark Gods, it is also their primary battlefield, the arena for the great game of supremacy. Since time immemorial, the Chaos Gods have warred with one another, vying for power amid the immaterial planes. Despite their myriad differences, the great gods of chaos have the same goal: total domination of the universe. With the ebb and flow of energy within the warp, the power of a Chaos God expands and contracts, and his realm will shift accordingly. For long periods, one god may dominate the others, fed by its own success and leeching its foe's energy for its own growth. Eventually, the other Chaos Gods will ally against the dominant force, and through combined efforts, reduce him in power until another of their number rises to prominence. This pattern is played out again and again throughout eternity. This passage is important because it establishes two key things. First, the Chaos Gods are not equals. Their power fluctuates constantly depending on the state of the warp and the emotions of mortals in the material universe. Second, there are periods where one god genuinely rises above the others and becomes the ascendant power of the Great Game, at least until the remaining three inevitably unite to drag them back down. Which brings us to the next section of this video. Throughout the history of the galaxy, which of these four gods has actually stood at the top of the pantheon? If you don't want to go through the entire metaphysical and cosmic history of when each Chaos God was Ascendant across all time and space, then skip to this number on screen. Sorry, I just had to put that there as a disclaimer. With that out of the way, let's go through the timeline of 40K and see when each Chaos God was Ascendant. Before jumping into all of the recorded instances of a Chaos God ruling supreme over the warp and their kin, it's important to acknowledge one thing. There have probably been an almost infinite number of occasions where one Chaos God temporarily gained ascendancy over the others. After all, the warp is, timeless. The issue is that it's just kinda hard to quantify most of these eras. Either they were never recorded, can't be reliably measured, or are obscured by the contradictory nature of the warp itself. So for this section of my video, I'm going to be primarily discussing the specific instances where we know a Chaos God achieved supremacy over the Pantheon and was explicitly described as the Ascendant power within the warp. With all of that said, let's start from the very beginning, as the first recorded example of this takes us all the way back to the ancient myths surrounding Tzeentch. Yep, we're talking about Prime Tzeentch. In various Chaos Demon codexes, it is suggested that there was once a time when Tzeentch ruled supreme over the warp. And not only that, but also all of creation. Now, the exact circumstances of how Prime Tzeentch lost ultimately varies depending on the source you're looking at. In some accounts, Tzeentch surrenders because he foresees his own defeat. In others, he allows himself to be overthrown deliberately as part of a greater scheme to advance the great game. And in some other versions, he is simply defeated outright. Even the nature of the conflict itself varies depending on the interpretation. However, for the purpose of this video, we will be using the most commonly cited excerpt, found in the Blue Scribe section in the 8th edition Chaos Demons Codex. There was a time when Tzeentch ruled supreme over the warp, his powers vastly superior to those of any of his brothers, or so maintained his followers. In their envy and arrogance, the other dark gods set aside their differences and joined forces to overthrow the Architect of Fate. Territories too vast and maddening to comprehend were devastated in the cataclysmic conflict that followed. During the final battle, with defeat seeming inevitable, Tzeentch cast a great conjuration upon himself, crystallizing his thoughts and form, even as he was lifted from his perch and hurled against the endless mountains. Upon impact, his mighty form was shattered into 10,000 pieces. What this tells us is that at some point in the distant and myth-shrouded past, Tzeentch is depicted as having dominion over the warp itself before being overthrown by the combined effort of the other three Chaos Gods, Khorne, Slaanesh, and Nurgle. Of course, in typical 40k fashion, we don't know exactly when the hell this occurred. The text simply states that there was a time, placing the event outside any reliable chronological framework. So pretty much we really have no idea when this occurred. However, we can reasonably assume this belongs to some ancient prehistory of the warp, long before any event that could be anchored to material reality. But regardless of when this actually happened, the feat itself is pretty insane. But that is not it, folks. The text also implies that if Tzeentch were ever to regain this power, he would once again rule over all creation. Unfortunately for the Changer of Ways, but I guess fortunately for us, he is yet to reclaim that level of power. Even so, this still remains the greatest peak any Chaos God has ever achieved within the setting. In fact, as I discussed in both my Tzeentch power scaling video and in my top 15 most powerful entities in Warhammer 40K ranking, I consider Prime Tzeentch to be the second most powerful entity to have ever existed in Warhammer 40K lore, surpassed only by the potential power of the Dark King, the Ascended Emperor as the 5th Chaos God of Ruin. Now after Prime Tzeentch, things start to get a little bit more complicated. Thankfully, the 8th edition Chaos Demons Codex, which if you guys have noticed by now is literally my favorite codex in the world, gives us a ton of insight into several major periods throughout history where the balance of power between the Chaos Gods shifted dramatically. The first of these is the Great Lull, spanning roughly M15 to M25. During this period, humanity developed the warp drive, standard template constructs, and countless other technological marvels, as mankind spread across the stars. While the Codex never explicitly states which Chaos God ruled supreme during this period, I think the answer is rather obvious: Tzeentch. After all, this was an age defined by change, innovation, ambition, discovery, and advancement, the very concepts that empower the Changer of Ways. Humanity was constantly reinventing itself and pushing the boundaries of technology. If there was ever a period tailor-made to feed the Architect of Fate, it was this one. So while we can't say with absolute certainty that Tzeentch stood above his brothers during the Great Lull, the evidence points heavily in that direction. Of all the Chaos Gods, he was by far the one whose domain most closely aligned with the defining characteristics of that age. Moving on, during M25 to M30, a period referred in the 8th edition Codex as the Awakening, and more commonly known as the Age of Strife or Old Night, it is not explicitly stated that any one Chaos God rules supreme over the Pantheon, as the Codex states that warp storms began to erupt across the galaxy as humanity's vast interstellar empire was fractured into countless isolated pockets. Entire worlds were cut off from one another, and the golden age of humanity's expansion came crashing down. But the Codex does note during this period that as holes emerge in real space, Khorne's bloodthirster generals lead the Blood Legions in demonic incursions that slaughter the populations of countless worlds. However, that's really the only direct mention of a specific god. Beyond that, the text generally refers to the Dark Gods as a collective force, enslaving entire star systems to their whims. Personally, I don't think there's enough evidence to conclude that any one of the Chaos Gods truly ruled supreme during this era. The galaxy was descending into complete anarchy, and all four gods appear to have benefited from the chaos. Around the tail end of M30 is also where we see the Emperor begin to emerge. Come on folks, this is a Fallen Cow video. Of course I'm gonna glaze the Emperor a little bit. It's gotta be done, or the authorities are going to break down my door and steal all my milk. And I can't allow that to happen.
I am the milkman. My milk is delicious.
According to that same 8th edition, Tzeentch foresaw that the Emperor could eventually bring about the downfall of chaos. In response, the Dark Gods set aside their rivalries long enough to work together, orchestrating the scattering of the Primarchs across the galaxy and disrupting the Emperor's plans before they could fully come to fruition. But that wasn't even the most important part of this entire era. No, that comes at the end. Because while humanity was completely fallen apart, the Eldari Empire still stood. Well, only for a little bit longer. Because as we all know, Slaanesh would be born at the tail end of M30. As the 8th edition Codex states, the advanced civilization of the Eldari falls into decadence and depravity. Such is the scale of their hedonism that a new god is born from the depths of their excess. Slaanesh, the Dark Prince. Upon manifestation, Slaanesh's primal scream obliterates the majority of the Eldari race in a single moment, and the race is pushed to the brink of extinction. The psychic violence of his apophysis consumes the worlds at the heart of the Eldari Empire. A vast section of real space is plunged into the warp, forming the rift that is most commonly known as the Eye of Terror. This is the birth of Slaanesh, and at the moment of her birth, Slaanesh consumed the vast majority of the Eldar race, devoured the entirety of their pantheon except for Isha, Cain, and Kegarak, and created one of the largest warp scars in the history of the setting. The amount of psychic energy involved is almost impossible to comprehend. We are talking about an empire of immensely powerful psychic beings that had dominated the galaxy for millennia, and they were devoured in an instant. Now, does that automatically make Slaanesh the strongest Chaos God at that exact moment? Well, I think the evidence strongly points towards yes. But admittedly and frustratingly, we never receive outright confirmation of this claim. There is some supporting evidence from the Liber Chaotica, which is an older source published in 2003. Can you guys believe it? That is literally 23 years ago. Holy shit, I am an old fart. This book is presented as an in-universe collection of notes and visions compiled by Richter Cliffs, a scholar attempting to understand the nature of chaos. Throughout this text, he witnesses events ranging from the war in heaven to the birth of Slaanesh. And regarding the Dark Prince's ascension, the book states, "For in the days when Slaanesh, last born and most beautiful, strove for existence, his power waxed stronger than all other gods, be they separate or together. And it seemed as though his spiteful triumph would destroy the balance in the warp." Now the issue with this one is that the Liber Chaotica predates a huge amount of modern Warhammer 40K lore. much of the content in this book has either been contradicted, heavily altered, or left in an uncertain canon status by later publications. On top of that, given that he's effectively a mad scholar attempting to document incomprehensible cosmic horror. Because of that, I don't think we can really use the Liber Chaotica as definitive proof. However, even without it, the claim that Slaanesh was the strongest at that current period of time is still compelling, as the Dark Prince was empowered by the deaths of billions of Eldari souls, the consumption of multiple Eldar gods, and the psychic collapse of the most powerful psychic civilization in galactic history. So I think it's quite reasonable to assume that Slaanesh ruled supreme over the other gods at that period of time in M30. So thus far, we've had Tzeentch rule supreme sometime in the distant past. He also ruled supreme from M15 to M25, and then at the tail end of M30, with the destruction of the Eldari Empire, Slaanesh was most likely the Ascendant Chaos God. Following her birth, the 8th edition Chaos Demons Codex states that the Great Game quickly resumed in earnest. And from the evidence presented in that codex, it does appear that a new god rose to become Ascendant. And it's not Slaanesh, it's Khorne, the Blood God. And personally, I think the reasoning behind this makes a lot of sense. While Slaanesh at the time of her birth probably had an unprecedented level of power, the newly born Chaos God also expended an enormous amount of energy fighting the Elder War God Khaine. As according to the 8th edition Craftworld's Codex, Slaanesh was exhausted after defeating the Bloody-Handed One, and due to this couldn't even devour him, forcing her to shatter him into thousands of pieces, rather than eating him like she did to the other Eldar gods. Due to this, it does make sense that Slaanesh simply lacked the strength necessary to remain at the top of the pantheon. Slaanesh and the Bloody-Handed God fought a titanic battle in the Warp, and despite Khaine's mastery of war, Slaanesh, glutted with stolen power, eventually proved the stronger. Exhausted from the struggle, Slaanesh could not destroy the Eldari God completely. Instead, Khaine was rent into fragments. Each shard came to rest within the Wraithbone core of a craft world, where it took root and grew into an avatar of the Bloody-Handed God. So it definitely appears that Slaanesh was exhausted after her duel, with the text openly stating it. And it seems immediately following Slaanesh's defeat of Khaine, all 4 of the Chaos Gods were equal for a brief period of time, at least before Khorne became Ascendant. As the 8th edition states, glutted upon the souls of the Eldari, the Dark Prince expands his domain. Such a bold move is met with great opposition, and the Chaos Gods turn their attention fully to the Great Game. So some time period after the fall of the Eldari in M30, Khorne gained ascendancy over the other gods, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh, who, as the 8th edition notes, temporarily set aside their rivalries in order to challenge Khorne's dominance. And in that same codex, Nurgle and Slaanesh launched a direct assault on Khorne's domain, while Tzeentch manipulated Khorne's armies away with illusions. Together, the 3 Chaos Gods pushed Khorne's armies all the way back to the walls of the Brass Citadel, with victory seemingly within their reach. Then, in what surely is the least suspicious event in Warhammer 40K history, a stray spark of Tzeentchian warp flame somehow ignited Nurgle's carefully cultivated gardens, which had spread to cover a vast margin of Khorne's realm. The resulting inferno devastated the ally armies, shattered the invasion, and handed Khorne the opportunity he needed to reverse the entire war. As the text states, meanwhile Tzeentch allies with Nurgle and Slaanesh to gain ascendancy over Khorne. Yet it is short-lived. The Blood God's immense rage at being usurped leads him to reclaim his lost territory and more besides. This passage explicitly confirms that Khorne was the Ascendant God at this period of history. Even though he was temporarily dethroned and came dangerously close to defeat, he ultimately emerged victorious and even reclaimed everything he had lost. So, since this is sometime in M30, that means heading into the Great Crusade era, Khorne appears to have been the dominant power within the Warp. Unfortunately though, this is where the evidence starts to dry up, since we don't have any explicit statements confirming that Khorne remained the Ascendant God throughout the Horus Heresy or immediately afterwards. That said though, the argument is definitely there. The Horus Heresy was arguably the bloodiest conflict in human history. Trillions perished as the Imperium tore itself apart, and the galaxy continued to burn throughout the scouring that followed. If any Chaos God was positioned to benefit from such an unimaginable level of warfare and slaughter, it was Khorne. You know, he is the Blood God after all. Still, it's more of speculation than outright confirmation. So the safest conclusion is that we have direct evidence placing Khorne at the top of the pantheon during the beginning and the end of the Great Crusade. But beyond that, while the evidence does suggest that he likely maintained that dominance throughout much of the Horus Heresy and perhaps even into the Scouring, we simply don't possess the definitive statements needed to say so with complete certainty. Following Khorne's rise during the Great Crusade, the next major change we are told about occurs during an era known as the Quickening, which occurred from M34 to M36, as the 8th edition states. Once more, the Imperium is beset by civil war in the Age of Apostasy. It is a time of false prophets and intrigue, of anarchy and war, and in the end, plague. As the stages of the Age of Apostasy unfold, Tzeentch, the Nurgle, become the dominant powers within the realm of chaos. And this does kind of make sense. The period from M34 to M36 is defined by political instability, conspiracy, rebellion, religious upheaval, and of course, change. First came the Nova Terra Interregnum, where the rulers of Segmentum Pacificus refused to recognize the authority of the High Lords of Terra, effectively splitting the Imperium in two for millennia. Then came the Reign of Blood, during which the Mad Ecclesiarch, Gog Van Dyer, seized absolute power, plunging the Imperium into paranoia, in which he ordered countless purges in his quest to maintain control. Wait a minute, that seems a little too familiar. Absolute power? Where have I heard that before? Oh well, I guess I'll never figure that one out. So yes, obviously, Tzeentch ruled supreme during this period. Schemes within schemes, political intrigue, betrayal, ambition, civil unrest, and civil war all fall squarely within the domain of the Changer of Ways. However, as this age continues, the balance once again shifts. The latter stages of this era saw the rise of the Plague of Unbelief, a massive political and religious revolt led by the apostate cardinal Bojaris of Galthamor, who declared Terra lost and Galthamor the true center of the imperial faith. Bojaris plunged vast regions of the Imperium into conflict and suffering. As disease, despair, and societal collapse spread, Nurgle's influence surged. In fact, during this period, Nurgle unleashed a catastrophe so severe that it consumed 8 entire star systems beneath a deluge of sickness. Endless rains transform worlds into oceans of disease, filth, and decay, creating a monument to Grandfather Nurgle's power. But after that, once again, things become very murky. For much of M37, we just don't know which Chaos God held supremacy. There are no explicit statements from the codexes or novels that allow us to confidently identify an Ascendant power during this millennia. This period does contain several major events that could support various different arguments. The Abyssal Crusade of 321 M37 saw 30 Space Marine chapters condemned by a corrupted Imperial Saint, forcing them to undergo a penance crusade into the Eye of Terror, which resulted in most of them either falling to chaos or being outright destroyed. Later in that same era, the 7th Black Crusade occurred, also known as the Ghost War, which threw the entire Imperium into a state of paranoia, as chaos forces erupted from the Eye of Terror before mysteriously vanishing without explanation. So, with these events occurring, you could certainly make an argument that these events favored Tzeentch. After all, deception, corruption, and paranoia are very much his specialty. But once again, there is no official source outright confirming that he was the Ascendant God during this period. So I'm just going to leave M37 a blank. Then we arrive at M38. And from this millennia into M40, we once again receive another definitive answer that a Chaos God ruled supreme over their brothers, as the Codex refers to this era as the Red Age dawning. And yes, if that title didn't already give it away, Khorne is back at the top. As the 8th edition states, the incessant warring of this period sees the rise of Khorne in the Immaterium, and the Blood God is once more first amongst the great game players. The chief victim of Khorne's rise is Nurgle, who falls below all his brothers in power. So not only does Khorne reclaim the top spot, but the port shut himself Nurgle gets sent straight to the bottom of the leaderboards. And once again, established lore supports this claim perfectly. This period overlaps heavily with the Age of Redemption, an era defined by fanatical crusades, religious extremism, unending warfare, and galaxy-spanning bloodshed. The Imperium spent thousands of years throwing armies into one conflict after the other, creating exactly the kind of environment that would empower the Blood God. If war is food for Khorne, then M38 through M40 was an all-you-can-eat buffet. Then we finally reach M40 and M41, a period the 8th edition refers to as the Time of Ending, describing it as an age marked by war, warp storms, and unprecedented rifts between the Immaterium and real space begins. Since Khorne's reign during a Red Age dawning ends in M40 and the Time of Ending begins immediately afterwards, it seems to imply that no single god was able to establish a lasting dominance over the others. That's not to say the Chaos Gods were inactive, far from it, as they still committed a heinous amount of atrocities across the galaxy. For example, Tzeentch's servants unleashed horrors such as the horror of Lysandro, where an entire world was twisted and destroyed by Tzeentch. Khorne's influence was felt during the Ghost Cataclysm, where the Blood God's own blade split a planet in two. Slaanesh's followers unleashed the Laughing Death, in which 100,000 demonettes overran an imperial world, and Nurgle spread the living plagues of Thruskis Sign, destroying a civilization that had eradicated natural illness, simply because Grandfather Nurgle took it too personally. In other words, from M40 to M41, each of the Chaos Gods was eating well. Then at the tail end of M41 came the event that changed the galaxy forever, the 13th Black Crusade. Abaddon the Despoiler leads a Black Crusade of unprecedented size against the fortress world of Cadia, intending to overrun its defenses and plunge on towards Terra. With him come the demon legions of the Warp, reality buckling before their advance. The Imperium shudders as a tidal wave of chaos pours into real space, and the galaxy stands on the brink of ultimate destruction. Cadia falls, although many Imperial forces escape its destruction, as infighting hampers Chaos's pursuit. But worse than just losing a single world, the destruction of Cadia shattered the ancient network of Blackstone pylons that had helped contain the Warp's influence upon reality. What followed was the Great Rift.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
Reality itself cracks under the pressure of millennia of chaos. Machinations come to fruition. With the release of a tidal wave of apocalyptic energies, it seemed tears between real space and the Warp. The Noctis Octurna, the Great Blackness, blankets the galaxy, snuffing out the light of the Astronomicon and throwing the mortal races into disarray. For a time, the ruinous powers glut themselves on the raw motion that runs rampant. When the darkness eventually passes, the galaxy remains afflicted by warp storms of a severity not seen since the Age of Strife. The Imperium reels as thousands of populated planets are destroyed or corrupted and many more cut off and isolated. They name the pulsing tear in the galaxy the Cicatrix Maledictum, or more commonly known as the Great Rift. And with that horribleness, we finally arrive in the current era of 40K. Now yes, I know, that was a bit of a tangent. Could I have skipped the entire history lesson and made this video significantly shorter? Absolutely. Was it strictly necessary? Probably not. Did it scratch my autistic itch to track down which Chaos God was winning the great game across 10,000 years of galactic history? You bet your bottom dollar it did. And that's what really matters, folks, is scratching that itch. But now we finally get to the main event. And if we're going to rank the Chaos Gods from weakest to strongest in the current era of 40K, we need to start at the beginning of the modern era. The invasion of the Scourge Stars, the Plague Wars, and ultimately the War in the Rift. Now technically, a lot happens before we get there. Guilliman awakens, the Battle of the Lion's Gate takes place, the devastation of Baal occurs, the Dominus Crusade is launched, and the Psychic Awakening begins reshaping the galaxy. But through it all, not a single Chaos God gains ascendancy. But that changes with the invasion of the Scourge Stars. So buckle up, fellas, let's finally start ranking the Chaos Gods from weakest to strongest in the current setting. Before we jump into the muck, filth, and disease of the Plague Wars, we need to set this stage properly. Because the Great Rift had just erupted across the galaxy, chaos was ascendant, the Chaos Gods were feasting upon the raw emotions unleashed by the collapse of reality, but Guilliman had returned and was attempting to stabilize the floundering Imperium. Unfortunately for him though, the situation was heavily skewed against him and the forces of mankind. This is also where we get our first major indication of the Chaos God's actions following the creation of the Great Rift. And let me tell you folks, it all centers around the Scourge Stars. For those who don't know, the Scourge Stars are a collection of worlds located to the galactic north of Ultramar. And it is here that Nurgle first establishes a major foothold in real space, in a bid to overtake and absorb the realm of Ultramar. Nurgle sends forth from his garden dozen plague legions to overrun the 3 sprawling star systems to the galactic north of Ultramar. Once conquered, these worlds become a stronghold for the Plague God's mortal and immortal followers. Using the Scourge Stars as an operating base, the Plague Father is able to launch continuous attacks against the nearby realm of Ultramar. And just to make sure of his victory, the forces stationed within the Scourge Stars were commanded by some of Nurgle's greatest servants, including the Demon Primarch Mortarion, the Herald Typhus, and the Great Unclean Ones Kugaf and Rictus Rainfather. Together, they were charged with a single objective, adding the worlds of Ultramar to Nurgle's garden. And for a while, they brought havoc to Lord Rabute Guilliman's domain. Around this time, however, Tzeentch began looking upon the Scourge Stars with jealousy. Desiring territory of his own, the Changer of Ways dispatched his own legion to establish a new realm of madness within the Stygus sector. So just like Nurgle, Tzeentch claimed his own territory in real space. But while he was doing so, Nurgle began his full-scale invasion of Ultramar. Issuing forth from the Scourge Stars, Nurgle's Plague Legions begin a lengthy campaign to corrupt Ultramar. His invasion is broken into 3 spearheads, who push deep into the 500 worlds, attacking along hundreds of fronts and bringing with them unnatural pestilence and decay. The defenders of Ultramar, both Astartes and mortals alike, fight bravely but steadily lose ground. Reinforcements arrive in the form of Primaris Marines from the Ultima Founding, but even these transhuman warriors could do little more than slow the Plague Father's advance. By approximately 012 M42, the Imperial defenders across Ultramar had been depleted by dozens of campaigns, while Plague fleets had systematically dismantled Ultramar's defense fleets and many of the realm's star fortresses. But that changed when Guilliman was ultimately forced to return from the Indominus Crusade to aid his realm. Bringing with him a sizable force, and of course his strategic genius, he was able to launch several masterful defensive maneuvers, which brought the combined plague armies to a standstill. Finally, at the Battle of Parmeno, as seen in the end of the book Plague Wars, with the help of a living saint, Guilliman is able to defeat the Plague armies and deal a crippling blow to the forces of Nurgle. After this battle, Nurgle commanded his armies to return to the Scourge Stars. Not because of this defeat, or solely because of Guilliman, but because 2 other Chaos Gods had decided that Nurgle was becoming a little too successful, as we see in the book Dark Imperium Godblight. That's why I'm here, he lured. You're running out of time. The Changer is making his move on Grandfather's ground. There will be fighting in the flower beds, war in the glass houses of the damned. It is starting now in the Scourge Stars. There will be another accord, I am sure, but for now we have a new war. You have this, I know this. He smiled, we all know this. They move. Khorne and Tzeentch's legions have allied. They are jealous of Grandfather's gains and work to take the Scourge Stars from us. This invasion by Khorne and Tzeentch is further elaborated on in the 8th edition, because of course it is. which does mark the beginning of the War in the Rift. Tzeentch tricks Khorne into averting his gaze from his blood crusade to look instead upon the scourged stars. There the blood god spies Nurgle's diseased bloom fields blossoming within real space. Bellowing with rage, Khorne redirects his legions to attack his brother's growing domain. Dozens of Tzeentch legions follow in their red wake. So begins the War in the Rift, the largest conflict of the great game to ever spill over into reality. Now, both of these excerpts make it pretty damn clear that at the time of the Plague Wars and at the opening stages of the War in the Rift, Nurgle was truly the Ascendant Chaos God. Just think about it for a moment. When Prime Tzeentch ruled supreme, the other gods united against him. Or when Khorne sat atop the Pantheon, the other gods also united against him. And now, in the aftermath of the Great Rift, with the Plague Wars underway, it once again appears that multiple Chaos Gods are acting together to challenge a rival who has grown too powerful. So it's a pretty strong indication that Nurgle was sitting at the top of the leaderboards following his conquest of the Scourged Stars and his invasion of Ultramar. And so, since he is threatened by multiple Chaos Gods, he decides to recall many of his demons, and even Typhus himself, to defend his growing domain in the Scourged Stars. However though, Mortarion and Kugaf refused to abandon their plans, and continued their efforts to kill Rabute Guilliman and corrupt Ultramar to Nurgle's service. Which, I'm going to spoil for you guys, really does not end well for them, or for the big chud himself, Nurgle. Eventually, Guilliman and Mortarion meet in battle on the planet of Iax. And well, as we all know, when Guilliman fights a major villain, he tends to spend a concerning amount of time getting his ass kicked. Wanna see me lose to that Primarch? Wanna see me do it again? Before things somehow end up working out for him. And this fight is no exception, as Guilliman loses yet again, and is even injected with the God Blight, a plague created by Kugaf that should, in theory, and I want to emphasize the word should, have been able to kill absolutely anything, even a demigod Primarch like Guilliman. But between life and death, Guilliman experienced a surreal vision of his meeting with the Emperor, following the Terran Crusade. And then suddenly, he is infused with holy energy, resulting in him being resurrected and becoming a conduit for the Emperor's power. What happens next delivers a grievous blow not only to the Garden of Nurgle, but to Nurgle himself, as described in the book Godblight. Guilliman's eyes were glowing with pure white power, the last slimes of his decayed flesh burned away, and a network of feathery capillaries spread in their place, bearing new blood unsullied by the Godblight. The metal of the armor of fate shimmered, impossibly remaking itself. Bright decorations appeared as tarnish cracked and fell away. Wires grew and reconnected as surely as Guilliman's skin was growing back. The ground cracked and broke. Glaring whiteness blazed from the crevasses. Guilliman's corpse rose up and hung in the air, supported by a pillar of radius, and slowly turned so he was upright. He reached out and the Emperor's sword appeared in his hand, and burned with the fires of 1,000 suns. He gripped the sword of the Emperor two-handed and raised it high. Rising waves of fire ripped into the garden. From the great manse a cry of rage sounded, as a wall of flame hotter than 1,000,000 suns devoured everything in its path, finally breaking and receding within yards of the black walls of Nurgle's house. Its infinite hall shook, mossy tiles fell from the roof, sodden timber steamed. So Nurgle's servants not only fail to kill Guilliman, but the Emperor himself directly intervenes, burning a massive portion of Nurgle's garden, and even wounding the Plague God in the process. So Nurgle, who entered the Plague Wars seemingly as the ascendant power within the ruinous pantheon, suddenly finds himself fighting a war on multiple fronts, while at the same time suffering one of the most significant defeats inflicted upon any member of the Chaos Pantheon in the modern setting. Now, even after these grievous losses during the Plague Wars, the War in the Rift only continues to intensify. In response to the invasions, Nurgle launches 7 counterattacks, the largest of which strikes into the Stygus sector. For the Plague God rightly suspects Tzeentch is behind the assaults upon his real space stronghold. Even as Karos Fateweaver leads an assault upon Nurgle's garden, Rotgus heads the invasion of the Stygus sector. So despite being wounded by the Emperor and suffering a major defeat in Ultramar, Nurgle is still actively fighting both Tzeentch and Khorne at the same time. So it's reasonable to assume that maybe Nurgle was still the strongest, even after his defeat in the Plague Wars, but the war is still far from over. Now you're probably wondering, where the hell is Slaanesh during all of this? Well, to be frank as possible, Slaanesh is literally just screwing around. As the Codex states, Slaanesh allies with all three of his brothers at different times, his fickle nature drawing the ire of all, but Khorne especially. So yeah, while Khorne, Nurgle, and Tzeentch were engaged in the largest conflict of the Great Game ever to spill into reality, Slaanesh was effectively rage-baiting the entire Pantheon and switching sides whenever it seemed to be the most amusing. Still, the war continued to escalate even further and further. The titanic engagements between the Chaos Gods' legions take place across 100 fronts, but one single battle stands above all others, for none can match the sheer scale of slaughter that occurs upon the planet of Vigrid. Armies clash and powers of such magnitude are unleashed that the planet, now reshaped into a demon world, is shattered and the debris shifts into the warp, where the surviving combatants continue their battle as they float upon the formless seas of the Immaterium. It is a maelstrom of conflict unending, with each side sending in a constant stream of new legions. Seeking an end to the battle, Tzeentch suggests a contest of champions to settle the matter. Each of the Chaos Gods, sure of their own victory, agrees. So as the 8th edition Chaos Demons Codex states, it appears the war in the Rift went on for some time, but none of the gods seemed to be able to gain the upper hand. Which started as a 2 vs 1 conflict, with Khorne and Tzeentch attempting to tear down Nurgle's growing real space empire, devolved into a complete free-for-all. Every god was fighting for ownership of the Scourge Stars, dominance within the Great Game, and ultimate supremacy over the Pantheon. Personally, I think this directly means that while Nurgle was the ascendant power at the start of the War in the Rift, by the time of its conclusion, and the beginning of the Contest of Champions, Nurgle seems about equal with the rest of the ruinous Pantheon. And due to this, Tzeentch proposes a contest of champions to crown the next Ascendant Chaos God of the Pantheon. This is called the Clash of Champions, as depicted in the 8th edition Chaos Demons Codex. For a brief moment, the galaxy is freed of the baleful gaze of the Chaos Gods, for their attention is drawn elsewhere. Each of the brothers selects their mightiest champions alongside a few favored legions. A portion of each god's realm is reformed into the Amalgam, a swirling hellfield upon which the gladiatorial battle will take place. Slaanesh champions use their speed to quickly establish dominance, but stagger before the resilience of Nurgle's chosen. Tzeentch's champions unleash sorcerous bolts of such magnitude that time itself collapses around them. But none can match the martial prowess and endless fury of Khorne's warriors. The advantage continues to change hands until Tzeentch's foremost champion, Kairos Fateweaver, emerges victorious through trickery. So loud is Khorne's bellow of fury, however, that all of Kairos' illusions are broken and the battlefield itself blasted apart in fire, and even real space shakes at its foundations. With that, the Great Game resumes in a million different forms across a million different fronts. The galaxy's respite passes and the demon legions of the Chaos Gods once again turn real space into a constant battlefield at the behest of their dark masters. So that's the war in the Rift. And in typical Chaos fashion, it ends with nobody really winning and Khorne getting rage-baited for the 1000th time. What's important though is that this is the most recent major conflict between the Chaos Gods that we have detailed information about, at least from the perspective of the material universe. The problem is that the Clash of Champions doesn't really give us a clear winner. Sure, Kairos Fateweaver technically wins the contest, but he does it through trickery, and after he does so, the battle immediately falls apart, because Khorne throws a cosmic temper tantrum. Reality starts shaking, and the Great Game simply resumes as if nothing even happened.
See, now that's some bullshit.
No god emerges as the undisputed ruler of the warp, no throne is claimed, and no definitive hierarchy is established. So if there isn't a clear winner, how exactly are we supposed to rank the Chaos Gods? Well folks, well, your favorite fallen cow did his research, and I've come up with a very concise ranking. And unfortunately, it's kind of built purely on statements. Yes, purely on statements.
That's
Wait, hold on. I got one more.
Stop! Stop it! Leave that man alone!
But what else can you do, folks, when the Chaos Gods really just don't give us any actual feats in the current setting, at least against their kin? Thankfully, there are two very helpful statements that make ranking the Chaos Gods extremely easy. This section is titled The Eternal Rivalry, and I'm sure you've heard of it. And it gives us perhaps the clearest insight into the current hierarchy of the Ruinous Pantheon. There exists a hierarchy of sorts within the ranks of the Ruinous powers, though it ebbs and flows according to the vagaries of the Great Game. Currently, Khorne is held as the mightiest of all, for the practice of murder and blood sacrifice stretches to the dark beginnings of the universe. Though Khorne sees the use of sorcery as the refugee of cowards, his closest rival, Tzeentch thrives on the raw stuff of chaos and uses it to influence a million times a million plots. His devious mind always a step ahead of his opponents. Where Tzeentch would see hopes thrive and fortunes change, Nurgle, the father of plagues, revels in despair and hopelessness. In times of galactic pandemic, Nurgle's power can eclipse even that of his brothers in darkness. Last in the Pantheon is Slaanesh, who knows well how to play upon the obsessions of his rivals. Khorne's single-minded bloodlust, Nurgle's quest to infect every living thing, and Tzeentch's compulsion to dabble in the fates of mortals. All are obsessions which the Lord of Excess can turn to his will with a whispered promise. So yeah, this passage pretty clearly lays out the current hierarchy of the Chaos Gods following the Plague Wars and the War in the Rift. Yeah, I know, I probably should have started this video with this simple little excerpt because, it wouldn't have been, 40 minutes into this video and you finally get the rankings? And I apologize about that, but you're telling me you clicked on a Falling Cow video and didn't expect 40 minutes of peak autism? Come on, fellas, we all know better than that. But besides that, the first time I read this, I was rather surprised. Because even after being wounded by the Emperor, having his garden literally set on fire, and getting jumped like Mahito by both Khorne and Tzeentch at the same time, Nurgle is still not considered the weakest member of the Ruinous Pantheon. Nope, that distinction belongs to Slaanesh. So yes, fellas, yes, as of the current setting, the Dark Prince sits at the bottom of the Chaos hierarchy. And this isn't the only source that says so. Later in that same codex, we get another section titled Fear the Dark Prince. And let's just say, this excerpt doesn't really make me exactly quake in my boots. Of all the complexities of the Great Game, the most compelling, perhaps, is the relationship between Slaanesh and his brother gods. None can amplify Khorne's fury like the Lord of Excess, whose earthly luxuries and lusts defy the Blood God's desire for indiscriminate slaughter. The mere mention of Slaanesh or his schemes is enough to cause volcanoes to erupt across the Blood God's domain. Though Khorne is the only god openly hostile to the Dark Prince, Nurgle and Tzeentch are also ill at ease in his presence, despite the fact that the most typical hierarchy of power between the four Chaos Gods sees Slaanesh at the bottom. Even they feel the magnetic pull of his matchless charisma and are both attracted and repelled by their younger brother.
Oh, I'm shaking in my custom baby seal leather boots.
So once again, we're told outright that the most typical hierarchy of power places Slaanesh at the very bottom. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean Slaanesh is weak. This is still a Chaos God who was able to consume the entire Eldari Pantheon, who also devoured billions of Eldari souls, created the Eye of Terror, and has the potential to become possibly the strongest Chaos God. In fact, both lore and circumstance suggest that Slaanesh probably has the greatest potential ceiling of any of the four gods. The problem is that potential doesn't help much when we're talking about the current setting. Man oh man, is Slaanesh the Megami of the Ruinous Pantheon. I swear we're always hearing about the insane potential, but she never is actually sitting at the top of the rankings. Even when she was born, she is not overtly said to be the strongest. And throughout the 10,000 years of her existing, at least from the material perspective, Slaanesh has never overtly sat at the top of the Ruinous Pantheon. She really is the potential man. How unfortunate for the Dark Prince. But regardless of the memes, the evidence is still pretty straightforward, as we have two statements from the 8th edition placing Slaanesh at the bottom of the Chaos God hierarchy. So as of the current setting, coming in at number 4 and earning the title of the weakest Chaos God is Slaanesh. After the Dark Prince, the other 3 Chaos Gods get a little bit harder to rank. Fortunately, both the 8th and 4th edition Chaos Demons Codexes give us enough information to crack this code. First, the 8th edition codex explicitly states that Tzeentch is Khorne's closest rival, implying that the Changer of Ways sits much closer to the Blood God's power than either Nurgle or Slaanesh. This is further supported by the 4th edition, which states, almost as great in scale as Khorne's domain is the Crystal Labyrinth of Tzeentch, an iridescent plateau whose brilliance sits in stark contrast to the Blood God's wasteland. Whilst the Crystal Labyrinth is not so massive as Khorne's kingdom, it dominates the realm of chaos no less. Countless glittering pathways spring from the very heart of the labyrinth, fractal filaments that inveigle their way into the dominions of other gods and so bind the realm of chaos together. This directly supports the earlier claim that Tzeentch stands as Khorne's primary competitor within the Great Game. His realm may be smaller than Khorne's, but not by much, and its influence still extends through the entirety of the warp. So I may have done this a little bit out of order, but this means our number 3 spot goes to the stinky, smelly little green chud himself, Nurgle, the Plague Father. Now you're probably asking yourself, wait Cal, wait, wasn't Nurgle the strongest Chaos God during the Plague Wars? Well yes he was. At least from the evidence we have available. Well, let me tell you folks, a lot has happened since then, and most of it has not gone well for the little green chud. First, he effectively loses the Plague Wars. Not only does Mortarion fail to kill Guilliman, but the Emperor intervenes and inflicts catastrophic damage upon Nurgle and his garden. And that's why this whole thing is kind of a big deal, because the garden is quite literally the manifestation of Nurgle's power, shaped by his will and essence. In theory, this should be the place where Nurgle is at his absolute strongest. And yet the Emperor just kinda shows up and burns a significant portion of it. Worse still, Nurgle does not emerge victorious from the war in the Rift either. Despite beginning the conflict as what appears to have been the Ascendant God, he finds himself under constant attack by Khorne, Tzeentch, and occasionally Slaanesh. By the time the Clash of Champions concludes, there's little evidence that he has retained the dominant position he once held. I think all of this evidence really does make it seem that Nurgle is the second weakest in the current Chaos God Pantheon, due to the fact that we have codex statements placing both Khorne and Tzeentch above him, along with the events of the Plague Wars that most likely severely damaged his position. So while the Plague Father remains an incredibly powerful warp entity, the evidence I have on hand simply just points towards the fact that he is the second weakest Chaos God in the current setting, and so comes in at number 3 on my list. Which means at number 2 we have Tzeentch, the Changer of Ways. And for the same reasons I just laid out with Nurgle, I don't think Tzeentch coming in at number 2 is really that complicated, as we have multiple sources describing Tzeentch as Khorne's closest rival, placing him directly beneath the Blood God in the current hierarchy of the Chaos Pantheon. Like the 8th edition Chaos Demons Codex outright states as much, while older lore in the 4th edition consistently portrays the Crystal Labyrinth as one of the largest and second most influential domains within the realm of chaos. And when you really think about it, it does make sense. Hope, ambition, change, manipulation, deception, destiny, political intrigue, technological advancement, revolutions, schemes, betrayals are all things that define the current setting of 40K. Every faction in the setting is constantly changing, adapting, plotting, or attempting to alter their terrible fate. Whether it's Abaddon launching yet another Black Crusade, Guilliman attempting to reform the Imperium, the Tau expanding their empire, or the Necrons awakening from their tomb worlds, nearly every major change in 40K feeds directly into Tzeentch. But despite all of that power, all of that magic, all of that scheming, and all of those big ol' blue feathers, Tzeentch still does not sit at the top of the food chain. No. Number 1 goes to the Blood God himself, Khorne. Not only do the current codex statements rank Khorne as number 1 amongst his kin, but the entire state of the 40K universe practically exists to empower him, After all, as the famous quote goes, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And if there is only war, then there is only more fuel to fill the blood god. Every battle fought across the galaxy empowers Khorne. Every Imperial Crusade, every Tyranid invasion, or every Black Crusade. Pretty much any act of violence, slaughter, hatred, or bloodshed ultimately feeds the blood god. There is also the fact that Khorne seems to be one of the few Chaos Gods whose actions consistently produce visible, large-scale effects upon the material universe. For example, at the conclusion of the Clash of Champions, Khorne's roar is so powerful that it shatters Kairos Fateweaver's illusions and sends shockwaves into real space, shaking their foundations. Additionally, during the events of Arc of Omens, we literally see Khorne's influence manifested through the demon Primarch Angron, who uses Khorne's power to split a moon in two, and then even crazier corrupt an entire crusade fleet to the blood god's worship. So throughout the established canon, Khorne's rage has repeatedly bled into reality in ways that are often far more direct and destructive than the schemes of Tzeentch, the plagues of Nurgle, or the temptations of Slaanesh. Now, to be fair to the other Chaos Gods, this isn't necessarily a criticism of them. Khorne is the Chaos God of war, battle, slaughter, and bloodshed. So naturally, his influence is going to appear more obvious than that of a Chaos God, whose power comes from subtle manipulation, despair, or temptation. But even taking that into account, the evidence still points in one direction. The current hierarchy of the Chaos Gods has Khorne at the top. The modern state of the galaxy favors his power, his realm remains the largest in the warp, and throughout both ancient lore and modern narratives, Khorne repeatedly emerges as the benchmark against which other Chaos Gods measure themselves. So while Prime Tzeentch may represent the single greatest peak achieved by any Chaos God, and while Nurgle and Slaanesh have both enjoyed periods of supremacy throughout history, in the current setting of Warhammer 40K, there can really only be one answer. The strongest Chaos God currently in Warhammer 40K is Khorne, the Blood God, the Lord of Battles, and the current king of the Ruinous Pantheon. And that brings this video and my entire Chaos God miniseries to a conclusion. We started by scaling each of the 4 Chaos Gods individually, breaking down their abilities, their feats, and of course where they scale, compared to the rest of the 40K universe. Then we put it all together and answered who actually sits at the top of the Ruinous Pantheon. This video took a fair amount of research, writing, and editing to put it all together. So I really do appreciate you guys sticking through it to the end. Hopefully it gave you a clear picture of not just who's the strongest, but how power amongst the Chaos Gods has shifted throughout history. If you enjoyed this series and want to see more Chaos related scaling in the future, let me know down in the comments. I'm considering doing Vastor or Be'lakor next, but I'm open to suggestions if you guys want to throw them down in the comments. Of course, a huge shout out to my Patreon and YouTube members. Your support genuinely makes these videos possible and keeps the channel growing. Shout out Diomedes22, and Posse Paul, Tyler Pick 7, Musty, Keydry, Seth Capizilla, Lag, Simply Pain 66, Caleb White, Dinkleberry, Jack Roar, Morally Bankrupt 1461, Ritter S, Anish Chatterjee, and Luke Price. Until next time, my marvelous herd, stay milked, and I'll see you all real soon.